If you were a psychiatrist for the Iranian government, there's a good chance that your office would certainly be full of high-ranking state employees wailing that they've just gone through the worst year of their lives. Since February of 2024, Tehran has seen a helicopter crash kill its president, watched as the leadership of its proxies in Gaza and Lebanon got decapitated, and witnessed the regime of its Syrian ally Bashar al-Assad crumble into dust. On top of that, tit-for-tat exchanges of fire with Israel saw nearly all Iranian missiles shot down, while Israel was able to destroy much of Tehran's air defenses. As the New York Times summed up the cumulative effect of all of these disasters, Iran has never been weaker than it is today. So yeah, you can see why our imaginary shrink might be overwhelmed with members of the Revolutionary Guard and on the verge of nervous collapse. But while Iranian weakness might seem like a cause for celebration in Washington and Jerusalem, the reality isn't quite so clear-cut. Despite a protracted economic crisis, despite the lingering impact of mass protests, despite going through the geopolitical ringer, the Islamic Republic is still standing. Not only that, but its weakness might cause it to gamble on the sort of high-risk, high-reward strategy that only a year ago would have been written off as too dangerous. And what strategy could be higher risk or higher reward for Tehran than sprinting to build a nuclear bomb? We know. Warnings about an imminent Iranian bomb have been around longer than we have. It was all the way back in 2012 that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu famously drew a cartoon bomb for the UN General Assembly to illustrate Tehran's nuclear progress. But this time, something feels different. Not just because Iran has seen so much of its security architecture crumble, but also because its nuclear program is now so far advanced. As War on the Rocks put it, Tehran is weaker regionally than any time in the past decade, but with a more advanced nuclear program than ever before. Reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency have fleshed out what this means. Until recently, Iran was churning out 7 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium every single month. Per The Economist, that's enough to make around 2 nuclear bombs per year if enriched further. Now though, the regime is installing advanced centrifuges that could speed the process up, all of which may explain the disconcerting conclusion American intelligence reached in the dying days of the Biden administration, a conclusion that was last week leaked to the New York Times. According to the report, Tehran is exploring shortcuts to build a working bomb, a crude device that could be assembled and detonated on a timescale so compressed it would leave the world struggling to react, one that could be ready in time to deter what the leadership believes may be an inevitable Israeli attack. Now, it's important to stress that even if Iranian scientists can compress the timetable, we're still talking a matter of months rather than days. You may have heard in the media about Iran's breakout time being less than a week. Well, while this is technically correct, it's another one of those instances where the gap between what a phrase really means and what the public thinks it means is pretty damn vast. Breakout time, you see, is the time Iran would need to enrich uranium to the level of purity required to make a bomb, a period most experts measure in days. But making even a crude nuke doesn't just mean enriching some uranium, declaring job done, and celebrating with cocktails. You also have to go through the complex process of weaponization. The Institute for Science and International Security have done several reports on what this means for Tehran's weapons program. Writing on their website, physicist David Albright has explained the complexities of this process, one that includes, and this is just an extract from a long paragraph that we're quoting here, the mastery of the high explosive triggering system, the molding and machining of high explosives, and the building of a neutron initiator that starts the chain reaction at just the right moment to create a nuclear explosion. These are hurdles that Iran could clear, but only with sufficient time. As to how long that really is, well, let's just say there's arguments about it. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists recently published an article by physicist Hui Zhang, who drew parallels with China's attempts to build the bomb in the 1960s. By the time Beijing reached the rough stage Iran is at now, it was a mere 5 weeks from a working device. Now, obviously, the idea of Iran having a working bomb within 5 weeks of deciding to build one is terrifying, but Zhang's conclusions are not accepted by most. The Institute for Science and International Security published a sniffy rebuttal pointing out that China didn't have to work in utmost secrecy under the threat of Israeli airstrikes. Instead, they estimate that the fastest Tehran could assemble a nuke is 6 months. Now, that's still a painfully short period of time, yet we need to emphasize that even this wouldn't be a bomb that could be used against Israel or another American ally in the region like Jordan, at least not easily. No. To produce multiple warheads that could be delivered by missile, Iran would still be looking at a timeline of over a year. So what sort of nuke, in that case, are we talking about? And the simple answer to that is a crude one, a device with a fraction of the sophistication that Iran's nuclear program originally aimed for, an unreliable, lower-yield bomb that's closer to the nukes North Korea was testing in the early 2010s than anything in the American or Israeli arsenals. Such a bomb would be almost impossible to use offensively, barring the Quds force throwing it in a pickup and somehow managing to drive it into the center of Tel Aviv unchecked. Instead, the gamble would be that the regime could quickly assemble and test it as a warning to Israel and America. Don't screw with us, we're now a nuclear power. And make no mistake, this would be an insanely risky play. As we mentioned earlier, Tehran's air defenses have been largely destroyed. Their regime has been deeply infiltrated by Mossad. Israeli strikes have destroyed their missile stockpiles, and while President Trump seems extremely reluctant to start a confrontation with Iran, nothing would be more guaranteed to get the whole of Congress behind the idea of strikes than Tehran testing a nuke. That's if they even got that far. David Albright has gamed out different scenarios for how long Iran could keep its dash for the bomb secret once the Ayatollah gave the green light. His worst-case scenario involves Iran working clandestinely on weaponization for 4 months before beginning to enrich uranium. But even that wouldn't be enough. Quoting, "Once Iran diverts safeguarded enriched uranium to make weapon-grade uranium, it will be detected within a few weeks at worst, perhaps on the day it diverts." Albright goes on to add that, quoting again, "That time is more than sufficient for a devastating military response by Israel, hopefully supported by the United States and other allies." And just to remind you again here, this scenario still only results in a crude device that can at best be tested, not an arsenal of nuclear-tipped ICBMs that would threaten Israel's existence. Put like that, you might be wondering what all the fuss is about. After all, we've just seen Israel devastate Hezbollah. Surely they could do the same for Iran's nuclear program. Some Israeli officials really seem to believe that, especially if American bunker-buster missiles are supplied. But others fret that Iran's program is now so advanced and dispersed that all they'd do is delay the inevitable. And the cost of that delay might be a wider Middle East war. Speaking to Al Jazeera, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi threatens an all-out war should Israel strike their nuclear facilities. And while that could just be bluster, it's worth remembering that Tehran still has a formidable military plus remaining proxies in Yemen and Iraq. You wouldn't put good money on Iran winning such a conflict, but nor would you bet on Israel walking away unscathed. On the other hand, how could the world not unleash strikes should Iran dash for the bomb? I mean, we've all seen what happened with North Korea. Despite increasingly heavier sanctions since 2006, Pyongyang has a more advanced nuclear program than ever before. Now, to be clear, none of this is fated to happen. Iran's leaders know how dangerous this course of action would be for them. It might be that they turn to other options instead. War on the Rocks thinks they might prioritize rebuilding their network of proxies to restore their strategic depth. But the fact remains that the Islamic Republic is weaker and more worried than it has been in a long time. And if that fear leads them to make a desperate nuclear gamble, then it'll be the entire Middle East that suffers. Next up, we travel to the nation of Turkey to focus in on the Ankara leadership's efforts to expand their role as a regional power while squeezing the Kurds of autonomous Rojava in Syria. On February the 5th, Turkey's foreign minister announced that his country had a new plan to combat jihadist extremism in the Middle East, but it's the potential for that plan to cause much broader change in Turkey's favor that we're going to explore today. According to Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, speaking with Turkey's state-owned news organization Anadolu, Turkey has reached an agreement with 3 other Middle Eastern nations to directly combat the Islamic State. Those 3 nations, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, have apparently reached an early-stage agreement to cooperate and cross-coordinate military and intelligence operations, strengthen regional borders, and more. Precise details were scarce, although Fidan did state that the nations would soon hold a first multilateral meeting to further their joint effort. Now, the date of that meeting, as well as any start date to the actual defense initiative in question, has not yet been announced. Fidan's statements echoed a prior comment made at a news conference in Qatar several days prior when Fidan and Qatar's Prime Minister jointly announced that Syria's new leaders would take responsibility for Islamic State prisoners on its soil. Now, here on the Situation Room, we've spoken repeatedly in recent months about a potential resurgence by the Islamic State in the open deserts of the Middle East, especially in parts of Syria and neighboring Iraq, where state authorities are only minimally present. Operating asymmetrically, extorting villagers and raiding oil convoys, the Islamic State has seemed to gain both numbers and organizational strength over the last year or so. Military actions by a range of anti-Islamic State actors have failed to rein in the group as it's become ever clearer that the Islamic State's current fighters have learned the lesson of their 2010s attempt to form a caliphate and have now changed course to operate as an insurgency. That problem was only made worse with the fall of Bashar al-Assad, who was certainly not an effective leader in suppressing the Islamic State, but who had at least proven able to keep the group from storming Damascus. The issue with the takeover by Syria's new leaders is less that there'd be a friend to the Islamic State, they are very much the opposite, but that weak leadership in Damascus could further intensify the security vacuum that was allowing the Islamic State to flourish. In the wake of Assad's ouster, it's been the Kurdish-led forces of autonomous north and east Syria, better known as Rojava, who've been regarded internationally as the best hope at keeping the Islamic State in check. Rojava and its paramilitaries, the Syrian Democratic Forces, have a long history of successful combat operations against them, and they've leveraged long-time support from the United States to that same end. But Turkey considers Kurdish Rojava an adversary. It's been pressuring the rest of the world to disengage from agreements with the Kurds, and it's been trying to goad the new Syrian government into taking harsh measures against them. But for a while now, Turkish leadership has understood that it'll be a hell of a lot easier to get the West to disengage from Kurdish Rojava if there's an alternate answer to handle the Islamic State. And with this new announcement, that's precisely what Turkey seems to be trying to offer. In his February 2nd remarks about the plan, Foreign Minister Fidan tied the new multilateral initiative between Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria directly to the United States' ability to cut ties with Rojava and the SDF. Speaking to foreign media on that date, Fidan explained that the SDF has been guarding Islamic State prisoners and keeping them from escaping, something that the SDF does do while keeping control over about 9,000 potential Islamic State fighters and multiple tens of thousands of people suspected of having ties to the movement. Turkey has been trying to make the argument to the US and Europe that the SDF has done very little to actually fight the Islamic State, a dubious claim at best, but Fidan emphasized that asserting control of those prisons would be very important. Said Fidan of Ankara's attempt to address America's concerns, quoting here, "We hope that President Trump will make the right decision and right this wrong," meaning cut ties with the Rojava government and the SDF as soon as possible. And hours after Fidan formally announced the new four-way anti-Islamic State initiative, an exclusive report from US outlet NBC News suggested that Turkey might soon get its way. According to NBC, the US Department of Defense is currently drawing up plans for the United States to withdraw all of its estimated 2,000 troops from the nation of Syria. The DoD, according to two unnamed American defense officials, are responding to interest from Donald Trump and his close allies to pull up stakes. The DoD is currently working on a 30, 60, or 90-day withdrawal option, suggesting that no matter which option Trump ultimately chooses, an American withdrawal is going to happen fast. With those troops' departure, American on-the-ground support for Rojava would functionally conclude, although it's possible that intelligence sharing practices or drone strikes could continue indefinitely. And with Ankara growing ever closer to Washington under Trump, a Turkey-led initiative sliding in and filling the gap would probably provide the Trump administration all the reassurance it needs to pull the plug. Alongside the ramifications for the United States, Turkey's efforts will likely lead to major changes in both Kurdish Rojava and the Syrian government. In Rojava, high officials have been signaling for months that if American and Western support dries up, they'll probably abandon Islamic State prisons entirely. The reason for that is that Rojava expects direct attacks from either Turkish-backed Syrian militias, the Turkish government, or both. Pulling back from Islamic State camps, as well as from other far-flung locations across their territory, would allow the SDF to consolidate its forces around major population centers and give itself a better chance of fighting back. For Syria, conversely, engagement with Turkey in this matter is a double-edged sword. On one side, the new Syrian government has been significantly more willing to work with Rojava than Turkey has been, meaning that if Turkey gets more heavily involved in matters of Syrian security, Damascus may be less able to work with the Kurds how it would want to. On the other side, being asked to join such an initiative is a major positive mark for Syria's new leaders. Not only do they appear to have some degree of trust from multiple regional governments, but they've been asked to take part in a multilateral security initiative without a clear end date, suggesting that these other nations are willing to invest in them for the long term. Militarily, joint operations between these four nations are an interesting prospect. Syria lacks the military hardware to really pack a punch on the battlefield. That's largely a result of Israeli airstrikes immediately following the collapse of the Assad regime, destroying large amounts of military hardware with the stated goal of ensuring that it didn't fall into the hands of terrorist organizations. But Syria does have the experienced manpower that a group like this would need in order to engage in large-scale counterinsurgent operations. The new Syrian military, bringing together a wide range of ex-militias, has the fighting acumen to be the predominant ground fighting force against the Islamic State, especially if considerably more wealthy nations are able to foot the bill. Plus, it's probably a net positive for Syria's internal security to give all of its former militiamen a common enemy and keep them busy for a while as leaders in Damascus try to establish a long-term order with minimal infighting. Meanwhile, the Turkish military can offer thousands of main battle tanks and artillery pieces, ample surface-to-surface missile capability, and all the unmanned drones that a military operation could possibly ask for, plus hundreds of manned F-16s. Just a tenth of Turkey's military hardware could probably wipe out the Islamic State if used correctly and leveraged jointly with Syrian fighters on the ground. Jordan's army brings highly regarded special operators and all sorts of US-made kit that's been proven effective against the Islamic State, while Iraq brings hundreds of main battle tanks that are, quite frankly, more expendable than Turkey's and easier to replace, while still being a tank used against an insurgency with few weapons capable of stopping them. Iraq also brings more than enough troops to form an anvil along its own border with Syria, while the rest of the group could conceivably form a rather potent hammer. Now, even a basic understanding of the history of multilateral interventions like this will reveal that we're talking about a best-case scenario here. There are no guarantees, in fact, nothing even remotely resembling a guarantee that these four nations would be able to work together without major internal strife, let alone that they'd be effective in combat operations. There are a whole long list of reasons how and why an operation like this could prove unsuccessful, and the penalty for failure is a resurgent Islamic State. But at the same time, the risk and potential difficulty of such an operation, and the fact that somebody's got to take ownership over the result, may be a very big part of the reason why Turkey's chosen to go this route. The power balance of the Middle East is changing rapidly, and as the influence of other nations, particularly Iran, has begun to sharply decrease, they've left an influence vacuum that Turkey is eagerly trying to fill. Sure, a multilateral military operation like this could blow up in Ankara's face, with some pretty major penalties if that's what happens. But if Ankara is successful, then it'll have proven that it can lead the nations of the Middle East on military matters, making itself a more and more important power player and proving that it can demand the trust of the global West. Unfortunately, the loser in such an exchange is Rojava, where, cut off from American support, pushed back to a small number of defensible positions and engaging with hostile Turkey rather than a friendlier partner in the new Syrian government, the Kurds' list of options appears to be getting shorter. If Turkey is especially brazen, it can use its anti-Islamic State operations as a pretext to move heavy weapons and major military hardware to positions encroaching on Kurdish territory, encircling Rojava in the process. Within the last decade, the world has seen just how far Turkey is willing to go to assert control over what it perceives as Syria's Kurdish threat. If the Syrian government proves unable to talk Ankara down at the same moment as Donald Trump tosses the proverbial car keys to Turkish President Erdogan and invites him to take the Middle East for a spin, then for Kurdish Rojava, the results could be truly devastating. And in our final story of the day, we turn to the Mexican peninsula of Baja California, where a US warplane has been observed doing something mysterious. As Washington's new Trump administration threatens fire and brimstone against Mexico's drug cartels, flight tracking transponder data may have just revealed that there's something in the works. The report in question comes via The War Zone in an article published on the 4th of February. By tracking routine transponder data that can easily be obtained online, a TWZ reporter was able to observe an American intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance plane, or ISR plane, flying a route over the stretch of water that separates Mexico's Baja Peninsula from the rest of the country. The aircraft in question is known as the RC-135V, or the Rivet Joint, and it flew that particular route not just once, but twice. The aircraft in question took off each day from the Offutt Air Force Base in the central U.S. state of Nebraska and flew all the way to Southern California before cutting south, flying along the Pacific coast of the Baja Peninsula, and then turning around and flying back to the U.S. over the Gulf of California. From there, the plane went back to Nebraska each time. The aircraft did not appear to enter Mexican airspace, instead relying on the stretch of international waters between the peninsula and the rest of Mexico. And the war zone wasn't the only outlet to pick up on the flights either. Air and Space Forces magazine reported on the same flights and noted that a second aircraft, the US Navy's P-8 Poseidon, also flew similar operations. Air and Space Forces magazine spoke to the US Department of Defense, which confirmed the P-8 Poseidon flights and described them as missions to capture photos of the US-Mexico border. And that assertion checks out. The flights by the RC-135, however, were not verified by the Pentagon, and a source the outlet spoke with confirmed only that the RC-135 was conducting ISR flights off the Mexican coast. According to another outlet with close ties to the US defense apparatus, SOFX, these sorts of RC-135 flights are basically unprecedented, and that these highly unusual flights may have even been accompanied by flights via U-2 spy planes. Now, although we can't glean the exact purpose of those RC-135 flights, a look at the aircraft in question gives us some indication on what the US might be trying to achieve. First built by Boeing and introduced in 1961, the US flies a couple of dozen RC-135s, most of which have been heavily updated and modified as the years have gone on. The RC-135V, the rivet joint, uses a sensor suite that allows its onboard crew to identify and geolocate all sorts of electromagnetic signals. That signal's intelligence can then be passed along to all manner of potentially interested parties across the US military and intelligence world. The United States Air Force fact sheet on the aircraft explains that the rivet joint, with its 30-plus person crew, quote, supports theater and national-level consumers with near real-time on-scene intelligence collection, analysis, and dissemination capabilities. In plain English, the rivet joint is capable of identifying electromagnetic signals and pinpointing where they're coming from, allowing for the detection of adversary forces that might otherwise be well hidden or be blending in with the civilian population. And if that answers the question of what this spy plane is doing, then it's easy enough to figure out the why, because the Baja Peninsula is Sinaloa territory. More accurately, according to a map based on analysis by Crash Out Media in early 2024, it's disputed cartel territory, but the Sinaloa cartel maintain a dominant influence both on the peninsula and in sections of the Mexican mainland that these rivet joint flights would have been able to scrutinize. It's cartels like the Sinaloa that newly inaugurated President Donald Trump designated as foreign terrorist organizations on his first day in office, and it's these same cartels that Trump has frequently suggested he'd use military force against. The United States military has never launched a direct attack on cartels in Mexico before, but it's been a repeating promise of the Trump campaign before he was elected, and it's something that Trump's newly confirmed Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, has confirmed to be an option that the administration will actively consider. So with that background in mind, it's not difficult in the slightest to deduce what these rivet joint flights might be meant to achieve, mapping out locations of concentrated cartel activity, attempting to designate targets for future attack, and at the same time identifying pathways for flight over international waters that will allow the US Air Force to close in on targets without entering Mexican airspace. Now, make no mistake, a strike against Mexican territory would still be a major violation of Mexican sovereignty and one that could come with some real repercussions for the United States. But then again, it seems that Trump and his inner circle have been informed of that reality plenty of times and have yet to say or do anything indicating that such technicalities would make them pursue a different course of action. Within the United States, it's not quite clear yet how much authority Trump really has to authorize a strike against Mexican cartels, although under Article 2 of the US Constitution, he has the power to order these sorts of strikes without congressional authorization if there's a sudden need to defend the United States. According to reporting from at and around the Mexican border, American law enforcement and Border Patrol agents are increasingly concerned that cartels can and will use weaponized drones against them, something that would certainly grant Trump all the pretext he needs to get away with a retaliatory strike. Whether he'd wait for such a pretext, that's another matter entirely. The flights of the rivet joint aircraft will be able to gather very meaningful signals intelligence, but that signals intelligence paints a picture of the situation at one specific moment of time. If the Trump administration simply intends to keep tabs on cartels for now and prep strikes for a later date when the moment is right, then it'll likely keep on performing these flights to track cartel movement and ensure that they've got an up-to-date target list. Or, if Trump decides not to wait until there's greater pretext for a strike, relying instead on the designation of cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and on what Trump describes as a broader state of emergency at the border, then these overflights may indicate that a strike is coming sooner rather than later. Critically, designating these cartels as foreign terrorists does not give Trump the direct authorization to use military force against them without congressional approval. But judging by the administration's other actions since it took office, it may regard the parameters around Trump's actions as more of a series of suggestions rather than hard and fast rules. Regardless, the flight of the rivet joints up and down the coasts of the Baja Peninsula should serve as a clear indication that something is coming. Precisely when or precisely where that military action could take place is hard to pinpoint. But rivet joints don't simply take joyrides for no reason. For that particular plane to fly that particular route would be foolish if the goal were to merely surveil the US-Mexico border. But if the US Air Force wanted to designate targets on Mexican soil by identifying and tracking cartel bases of power, then that is precisely how it's done. Thank you for watching.